Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show for Monday, March the 29th, 2021. Do you remember a few years ago, this phrase, "it's okay to be white," became popular? And there was this ferocious backlash against it. How dare you say that it's okay to be white? What this taught me was that these people actually believe that it is not okay to be white, that white people are evil. They are witches. And here's a story by Victor Davis Hanson at American Greatness that talks to that. It begins with a quotation from Damon Young, a New York Times contributor. "Whiteness is a public health crisis. It shortens life expectancies, it pollutes air, it constricts equilibrium. It devastates forests, it melts ice caps, it sparks and funds wars, it flattens dialects." Again, what? "It infests consciousness and it kills people." And here is a quotation from Eli Mistal at The Nation. "Over the past year, I have, of course, still had to interact with white people on Zoom or watch them on television or worry about whether they would succeed in re-electing a white supremacist president. But white people aren't in my face all of the time. I can, more or less, only deal with whiteness when I want to. White people haven't improved. I've just been able to limit my exposure to them." You see how segregationism has come back, only this time as a positive. Hansen writes, "Racism is the deductive bias against and often hatred of an entire racial group. It is often birthed by dislike of particular individuals of a given group, and that supposedly justifies, by extension, disliking or indeed hating all of them. The popular reaction against this widespread toxic pathology shown African Americans birthed the anti-slavery movement, the Civil War, the resistance to Jim Crow, and the modern civil rights movement. But now there grows a strange new ahistorical anti-racism, racism." Well, I like Victor Davis Hanson, but he is using the enemy's language. If racism exists, it can be qualified and quantified, and if white people are the only racists, well, then it's all downhill from there, isn't it? He continues, "Another constructs a purported racial pathology to encourage segregation and separation from all members of the white race, thereby limiting all exposure to a toxic people. These are not just the idle critical race theory rants of intellectuals. They are now reified in racially segregated graduations and dorms and in systemic racialist re-education and confessional workshops in government, the military, and private enterprise. In fact, the new anti-racism racism is flagrantly directed at whiteness, the obsession of America gone mad." Barack Obama, who, when a senator, filibustered the 2006 Supreme Court nominee Samuel Alito, now claims falsely the filibuster is a racist relic of Jim Crow, which had predated by at least 30 to 40 years. On the Senate floor, U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth vowed to block confirmation of nominees based solely on their white skin color. In violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, the mayor of Oakland just announced race-based grants of $500 per month to be given only to poor BIPOC, that is, Black, Indigenous, and people of color families, excluding the white poor. The latest multi-billion-dollar stimulus farm aid bill is targeted for all those in need, so long as they are not white. The latter are all ineligible. The new anti-racism racism, whatever its original intentions, unfortunately exhibits the historical telltale signs of its noxious genre, an a priori negative stereotyping of all whites that can then be applied to individuals deemed undeserving because they are white. It is a deductive doctrine used to justify racial bias and racial preferences to enhance careers and profits, and to excuse and contextualize racist language and behavior. Anti-racism's implicit defense is that the non-white have less power to act out their biases than do whites. Well, it rights a historical wrong. Therefore, even crude anti-racist cannot be harmful racist. Consult the government data on hate crimes, however, and one learns some non-white groups have a greater proportional tendency to commit such crimes against others than so-called whites, and how as a white lower middle class generation born in the post-civil rights movement and the age of affirmative action continue to enjoy so-called white privilege. Notice how the term white racism, Hansen continues, began metamorphosing into white supremacy. The latter is a linguistic means of stating, without evidence, that they control everything, and thus there is little need for demonstrable examples of white racism. But supremacy itself proves a problematic rubric. What does one do when Asian Americans as a group make far more per capita than do whites? Or the 44th president of the United States was black, as is the current vice president? Or both the recent Democratic and Republican candidates for lieutenant governor in South Carolina, the first slave state to secede from the Union, were black? After all, a true Islamic supremacy state, such as Iran or Saudi Arabia, does not allow a Christian or Jew access to such power in their country. A racially supremacist nation, such as we see in communist China, cannot allow a black or white immigrant to be premier any more than can North Korea. Even South Korea or Japan may not any day soon see a Korean president or Japanese prime minister of Mexican or Irish ancestry. And yet white supremacy itself is devolving into white privilege. The newer term no longer requires proof that all whites are always supreme, only that they all, by use of the collective white, enjoy innately unfair advantages over all others based on their race. But finally, white privilege will itself prove an unsustainable rubric given the clear privileges enjoyed by millions of non-white Americans in business, politics, popular culture, sports, entertainment, the professions, and among the elite. Surely one should not have to argue that a white Dayton, Ohio tire changer is innately blessed in a way an unfortunate Eric Holder or Jay-Z purportedly is not. So white privilege is now morphing into just whiteness in a malignant stereotyping hauntingly reminiscent of the 1930 theories of insidious Jewishness, a term denoting a mythical and underhanded power that warped and controlled Western Europe, even as no believable charge could be leveled against individual Jews. Infectious whiteness, supposedly, is what explains why the privileged Meghan Markle is unhappy with, or rather furious at, the royal family and the psychodramatic injustices allegedly done to her as the former royal couple lecture the public on its sins from their $14 million Montecito estate. The whiteness conspiracy similarly explains why multi-billionaire Oprah Winfrey, who interviewed the couple from her nearby $90 million estate, not long ago was, or so she complained, treated rudely by a clerk in a Swiss boutique who committed the mortal sin of not recognizing Oprah and thus not purportedly retrieving a $38,000 crocodile bag out of its secure case quickly enough to Oprah's liking. Whiteness often towers over even 5'11" Michelle Obama. Even as First Lady, when incognito in a Target store, she complained that a much shorter white woman did not recognize her and asked her, a taller stranger, to help lift down an item from an upper shelf, a phenomenon that millions of Americans encounter weekly. Hansen continues, it took the media on the left about a nanosecond and without any evidence other than a grainy video to falsely label the recent Colorado mass shooter, later revealed as a Trump-hating Syrian-born Muslim, as a white supremacist. And it took only a second for the online mob and media to use his now falsely assumed identification to fuel a grand indictment against all white men in general, in the same old, unapologetic Duke Lacrosse, Covington Catholic kids, and Jussie Smollett style. There's much more of this from Victor Davis Hanson, but the question is, what do we do about it? Because we are looking at an actual threat now. Because if all white people are evil, then I guess retribution must be taken out against us. I would think that we should start with the Quislings, with the white Quislings. That every time one of them starts groveling and demand that we apologize, just say, stop it. Stop. No more apologies. In the United States, slavery ended, of course, in 1865, and Jim Crow was finished by 1965. And yet the demands become ever greater, ever more full of effrontery, that one must apologize for being white. Once again, you can meet the charge of white supremacy by saying to these people, you know, if white supremacy really exists, you wouldn't have a job. You wouldn't be paid to tell white people how bad they are. Rod Dreher at the American Conservative also touched on this. Again, he quotes Damon Young, who writes for The Root, which he notes is owned by the same people who own Jezebel, Gizmodo, and The Onion. Their parent company is Univision, which is Mexican, is it not? This fellow in the New York Times said a line can and should be drawn from the actions of the white supremacist who walked into 3 Atlanta area massage parlors yesterday and allegedly killed 8 people, 6 of whom were of Asian descent, to the relentless anti-Asian rhetoric pollinating national discourse over the past year. The former president, the party of the former president, can and should be blamed for this and the sudden increase of racist violence against Asian Americans. The line doesn't stop there, though. It extends back 400 years and has tentacles clawing everywhere. White supremacy exists here in America, which is everywhere. So I suppose one thing that Damon Young could be asked, that when black people kill white people, are they guilty of black supremacy? No. We've all seen the numbers, who is killing whom. And we all know the truth, even though we find that the truth is apparently so objectionable that it can't be mentioned anymore. A decade ago, Dreher writes, the author David Livingston Smith appeared on NPR to talk about his new book, Less Than Human, which covered the process of dehumanization as a precursor to mass murder. From the book, sometimes the Nazis thought of their enemies as vicious, bloodthirsty predators rather than parasites. When partisans in occupied regions of the Soviet Union began to wage a guerrilla war against German forces, Walter von Reichenau, the commander-in-chief of the German army, issued an order to inflict a severe but just retribution upon the Jewish subhuman elements. The Nazis considered all of their enemies as part of international Jewry and were convinced the Jews controlled the national governments of Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Military historian Mary Habeck confirms that soldiers and officers thought of the Russians and Jews as animals. They had to perish. Dehumanizing the enemy allowed German soldiers and officers to agree with the Nazis' new vision of warfare and to fight without granting the Soviets any mercy or quarter. The Holocaust is the most thoroughly documented example of the ravages of dehumanization, and yet focusing on it can be strangely comforting. It's all too easy to imagine that the Third Reich was a bizarre aberration, a kind of mass insanity instigated by a small group of deranged ideologues who conspired to seize political power and bend a nation to their will. When we think of dehumanization during World War II, our minds turn to the Holocaust, but it wasn't only the Germans who dehumanized their enemies. While the architects of the final solution were busy implementing their lethal program of racial hygiene, the Russian Jewish poet and novelist Ilya Ehrenberg was churning out propaganda for distribution to Stalin's Red Army. These pamphlets seethed with dehumanizing rhetoric. They spoke of the smell of Germany's animal breath and described Germans as two-legged animals who have mastered the technique of war, Ersatzmen who ought to be annihilated. The Germans are not human beings, Ehrenberg wrote. If you kill one German, kill another. There is nothing more amusing for us than a heap of German corpses. This wasn't idle talk. The Wehrmacht had taken the lives of 23 million Soviet citizens, roughly half of them civilians. When the tide of the war finally turned, a torrent of Russian forces poured into Germany from the east, and their inexorable advance became an orgy of rape and murder. They were certainly egged on by Ehrenberg and other Soviet propagandists, writes journalist Giles McDonough. East Prussia was the first German region visited by the Red Army. In the course of a single night, the Red Army killed 72 women and 1 man. Most of the women had been raped, of whom the oldest was 84. Some of the victims had been crucified. A witness who made it to the West talked of a poor village girl who was raped by an entire tank squadron from 8 in the evening to 9 in the morning. One man was shot and fed to the pigs. In academia, they call what Damon Young and Elie Mystal deal in as eliminationist language. And, when I ask the question, is it okay to be white? Anyone who does not immediately answer yes has to be regarded as an enemy. There's no other way. Oh, let's see. This is not a funny story, and I apologize for laughing. But over the weekend in Washington, D.C., a Muslim Uber Eats driver was killed by two black girls, one of whom was 13 and one of whom was 15. And as they are being taken away, one of them yells, "Oh, my phone is in the car." They hijacked the car. They carjacked the car, flipped it, killed the driver, and complaining about losing a cell phone. And what did the mayor of Washington, D.C., who is loudly demanding statehood, have to say about this? Quote, "Auto theft is a crime of opportunity. Follow these steps to reduce the risk of your vehicle becoming a target. Remember the motto, protect your auto." She later deleted this tweet, but the internet never forgets. And so, yes, the first instinct of the mayor of Washington, D.C. is to blame the man who was murdered. You shouldn't have been there in the first place. Let's have a look at the chat. Hello to G's He Style, Don from Beyond, Dan, El Caso 88, Corporal Clegg had a wooden leg. That's a Pink Floyd song, isn't it? White Boy Monday, who up, says Glib Medley. Hello to Professor Paul. White supremacist president, they got Biden. What's different, says G's He Style. The rhetoric is akin to murderous genocidal regime, says SR. Makes you wonder what will look like in 20 years. Well, last week I spoke of this University of Ottawa professor called Amir, Attarall, he actually said that the Quebecois had better start dancing to our tune, the tune of foreigners, because they're going to be a minority by 2050, with the rather explicit threat there that we are going to make your lives miserable. The sanitary dictatorship is in full throttle today. I will get to that. I'll just say now, I had thought, when it became clear that Biden was going to be in the Oval Office, that he would say, and the media would take this up, "Oh, COVID-19, yeah, we got the vaccines now. Orange bad man isn't running things anymore. So time to get back to normal." But you see the price of pushing panic. I suppose panic is a drug like any other drug, and people can become addicted to it. William Hicks says, an Asian means what exactly? The number of ethnicities, cultures, and religions encompassed by the geography of Asia is huge. Parts of Russia, Turkey, as well as India, China, Korea, Japan. Hello to Oscar Toe. Asian is media code speak for Chinese, says William Hicks. These highly educated media people are nothing but a bunch of racists themselves. Again, I would just caution people not to use that word because it has no efficacy. Its only purpose is to hurt white people. Steve says, I remember the Michelle Obama Target story. Initially, she just related it as a funny story of someone who didn't recognize her. A few months later, she retold it, and it had morphed into sinister racism. Well, of course, Michelle Obama is a graduate of Princeton University, and her senior thesis was about her miserable experience about being a Black woman at Princeton University. I don't doubt that Michelle Obama had a miserable experience at Princeton, but I suspect that the reason she did so is because she is such an obnoxious woman. Let's see. This is from Random Number Generator. Segregation is something I'm on board with, but why are whites so eager to subjugate themselves? Well, I mean, it's not as if, when I hear, for instance, that, people are in favor of all manner of things, in the war against carbon and now the war against the sun. Well, where are the voices on the other side? The same is true of the immigration question, of so many questions, that when one side is completely cut out of the conversation, then it's not really surprising that people are going to hold these views. Tricky Who says we've been socially engineered for decades to feel guilty because people shipped Africans and sold them at their auctions. Well, yes, when I see the Congressional Black Caucus, wearing their kente cloth, I think you're honoring the people who sold your ancestors into slavery to buy brandy and trinkets. MF Superstar says, it seems reflexively unfair that whites dominated the creation of the modern world when all the glory justice suggests that they subjugate themselves. Gavin McInnes. I think I lost that. Oh, that's why Gavin McInnes started Proud Boys with the motto, we will not apologize for creating the modern world. That's from MF Superstar. Oh, Gavin McInnes. Yes, he's fond of shoving things into himself. Strange fellow. He says, I married a native Indian woman, so, that means I'm not racist. People like him don't seem to understand that they are condemned solely by virtue of the color of their skin. And all of the groveling makes no difference. MF Superstar, teenage girl's first instinct after the crash was, where's my phone? Did it survive the accident? Oh, Adam says, I have several East Asian acquaintances at work. I perceive a bit of paranoia seeping into those relationships since woke propagandists began focusing on them. Well, it's a strong horse, weak horse, isn't it? I mean, so if you follow the internet, you've known that the Chinese people in particular have been complaining about attacks, verbal and physical, by blacks for years and years and years. Oh, but it's all Donald Trump's fault. And people actually buy this. Professor Paul says, Asante mostly bought guns with slaves so that they could conquer more land and take more slaves. Okay, let's get back to it here. And I guess it's all coming to a head, actually. Oh, you know what else is racist? Crosswalks. Yeah. This is from Secretary Pete Buttigieg 5 days ago. These disparities are awful, but we know how to fix them. It's time to reverse these patterns of exclusion and invest in safer, equitable streets. The burden is not shared equally. Relative pedestrian danger by race and ethnicity, 2010 to 2019. Asian Pacific Islander, 30.5. White non-Hispanic, 53.5. Hispanic Latinx, 55.1. Black or African American, 89.6. And American Indian or Alaska Native, 111 by 5. Of course, the likelihood of one being killed while crossing the street obviously has nothing to do with personal behavior. Oh, no. That would be outrageous to suggest. This is from Nate Church at Breitbart. USA Today editor fired after blaming angry white man for Boulder shooting. USA Today's Hamel Javeri said she was fired Friday after publicly asserting the Boulder, Colorado mass shooter would be an angry white man. USA Today race and inclusion editor Hamel Javeri. Nice work if you can get it. No? Race and inclusion editor. Let's see. Julie DiCaro had tweeted, extremely tired of people's lives depending on whether a white man with an AR-15 is having a good day or not. Javeri responded with the assertion that it's always an angry white man. always, when police announced the shooter was Syrian-born Ahmed al-Alawi Alissa, Javeri hurried to delete her tweet. She was not fast enough, however, to keep her job. Numerous tweets accusing her of racism flooded the conversation, along with those calling for USA Today to fire her. I'm shocked and appalled that the race and inclusion editor at a major newspaper is, in fact, a racist. Maxine Waters is in the news. She told on Spectrum News' One's In Focus SoCal that police in America believe their greatest challenge and their greatest chore is to keep Black people in their place. Anchor Tanya McRae asked, "We again witnessed racial tensions explode in this country after the death of George Floyd." Note the passive language there. We witnessed racial tensions explode in this country, as opposed to, say, people burning down cities. What do you think? Why do you think that this country has such difficulty learning from history and making real changes when it comes to violence and injustice done to Black people? She said, "I believe that it stems from the history of this country. It stems from slavery, when whites were absolutely in charge and they absolutely controlled the lives of people and their families. They decided to separate families and send the boys in one direction, the girls in another, the mothers to the big house. I mean, they've always been in charge. I think that this thinking about the need to control, the need to, make sure that people stay in their place, so-called, has been what has happened in America all of these years. And I think it continues in various ways, sometimes a little bit more sophisticated ways. The police, I really think, believe, and in some ways are led to believe, that their greatest challenge and their greatest chore is to keep Black people in their place." And again, Maxine Waters has been a member of the House of Representatives for 50, 100 years? If such a thing as white supremacy existed, she never would have been elected. I see that she was born in 1938. She's another one of these Democrats who is clinging to office as a limpet clings to a rock. Again, from Breitbart News, a graphic novel for children from the wildly popular Captain Underpants series is being pulled from library and bookstore shelves after its publisher said it perpetuates passive racism. The book under scrutiny is 2010's The Adventures of Ook and Gluck by Dave Pilkey, who has apologized, saying it contains harmful racial stereotypes and is wrong and harmful to my Asian readers. The book follows I'm sorry for the confusion here. It's just that these stories are barely edited anymore, and they are full of superfluous words or missing words or misspelled words. So much of my hesitancy comes from this. The book follows about a pair of friends, that's what it actually reads, who travel from 500,000 BC to 2222, where they meet a martial arts instructor who teaches them Kung Fu, and they learn principles found in Chinese philosophy. Sounds pretty horrifying, doesn't it? Scholastic said it had removed the book from its website, stopped processing orders for it, and sought a return of all inventory. Are they going to call in a priest to exorcise their warehouse? We will take steps to inform schools and libraries who may still have this title in circulation of our decision to withdraw it from publication, the publisher said. Pilkey, in a YouTube statement, said he planned to donate his advance and all royalties from the book sales to groups dedicated to stopping violence against Asians and to promoting diversity in children's books and publishing. I hope that you, my readers, will forgive me and learn from my mistake that even unintentional and passive stereotypes and racism are harmful to everyone. I apologize, and I pledge to do better. Yes, was this apology extorted at gunpoint? This guy, Pilkey, he's one of these Quizlings of which I spoke of. Oh, Al Sharpton calls for Derek Chauvin's conviction ahead of murder trial. But of course he would. Stacey Abrams making money off scam racket election bill disinformation. This is from Ashley Oliver at Breitbart. This is Jim Crow 2.0 the Election Integrity Act in Georgia. People are going to die of thirst because people can't bring water to them. You know, I walk out on the street, and I know it's pretty much the same in America, that you see all of these people who are carrying cartons of thermoses, flasks of every kind of liquid imaginable, because apparently there's a vast fear of dehydration plaguing us. Oh no, I'm standing in an election line and no one can deliver water. Wow, that's a very interesting problem. Very 2021 problem. Apparently Black people cannot learn how to read music. Now, I know this is not true because I've spent a lot of time reading about session musicians. And there are some people who get away with it, like Glenn Campbell was a big-time session cat in the 1960s. He never learned how to learn to read music, but pretty well everyone did. And you can't get the high-paying jobs if you don't know how to read from score. But this is from Raven Sant at the Daily Mail. The University of Oxford is considering scrapping sheet music for being too colonial after staff raised concerns about the complicity in white supremacy in music curriculums. Professors are set to reform their music courses to move away from the classic repertoire, which includes the likes of Beethoven and Mozart, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement. University staff have argued that the current curriculum focuses on white European music from the slave period, according to the Telegraph. Documents seen by the publication indicate proposed reforms to target undergraduate courses. It claimed that teaching musical notation had not shaken off its connection to its colonial past and would be a slap in the face to some students. What the students who decide to study music and also decide that they are not going to learn musical notation. Oxford added that musical skills should no longer be compulsory because the current repertoire's focus on white European music causes students of color great distress. I suspect that these people cause great distress by pretty much everything that they see and hear. I would suggest that they stay away from universities, because the less you know, the less likely you are to be offended. The proposals caused some upset among faculty members who argued that it was unfair to accuse those teaching music from before 1900 of being concerned with just white. Is anything particularly important about the year 1900? It comes after one Oxford college removed the name of an 18th century slave trader from its main library earlier this year, but has defied calls to take down his statue. Yes. So Oxford University is expensive, but apparently it is determined to make itself worthless. Oh no, we can't teach anything which might cause some students some distress. Well, then pack it in. Seriously, if they don't want to teach anymore, why do they still exist? This is from Vivek Chaudhary at the Mail Online. The father of the teacher at the center of a blasphemy row after allegedly showing students a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad says his son fears he will be murdered and will never be able to return to his old life. The teacher in his 20s, who is not being named, has gone into hiding with his partner after receiving death threats. Speaking exclusively to Mail Online, his father said, "My son keeps breaking down crying and says that it's all over for him. He is worried that he and his family are all going to be killed. He knows that he's not going to be able to return to work or live in Batley. It's just going to be too dangerous for him and his family. Look what happened to the teacher in France who was killed for doing the same thing. Eventually they will get my son, and he knows this. His whole world has been turned upside down. He's devastated and crushed." And so you see the advantages here of a policy of importing millions of people who hate us. I touched on this earlier. This is from Christian Britsky at Reason. Basic income programs in Marin County and Oakland exclude white people. Is that legal? Well, the answer mostly hinges on how much the government is involved. Well, isn't it governments who've adopted these policies? Let's see. Limiting eligibility of these programs by race could well prove legally problematic, says Walter Olson from the Cato Institute. The U.S. and California constitutions, he notes, generally prohibit race-selective programs and public services. Is this story for real? The U.S. Constitution means whatever the 9 members of the Supreme Court say it means. No more, no less. And if the members of the Supreme Court decide giving money to black people, but expressly not to white people, is a good thing, they will invent some legal justification for it. The trial of Derek Chauvin has begun in Minneapolis, and there is no question that this is a show trial. That everyone involved with this knows that Chauvin must be convicted, or Minneapolis will be set on fire. So this cop must be sacrificed. I saw, again, that someone at Duke University pinned a copy of Chauvin's toxicology report to a Black History Month poster, something like that. This is now being officially investigated by the university. This is from the Star Tribune in Minneapolis by Reed Forgrave and Maya Rao. George Floyd pleading for his life under the knee of a Minneapolis police officer has become a defining moment of our time. Yes, career criminal dies in police custody, resisting arrest. Yeah, that's such a remarkable story. That hardly ever happens. What began 10 months ago at the corner of 38th Street and Chicago Avenue has transformed into nothing less than an American reckoning on justice, racial equity, the proper role of law enforcement, and the historical wrongs society has perpetrated on Black people. Monday morning, that moment leads to the 18th floor courtroom of the Hennepin County Government Center, where a jury will begin to hear a murder and manslaughter case against since fired police officer Derek Chauvin. The trial itself is about what happened that May evening, but it will also be a vessel into which a splintered society places its rage, anxieties, and hopes. Wow, that is quite a sentence. A vessel into which a splintered society places its rage, anxieties, and hopes. Like the trial after Rodney King's beating, like the trial after Emmett Till's murder. How long ago was that? Like the Scottsboro Boys trial again. You don't have any more recent examples? This case will be viewed as another chapter, perhaps a turning point in America's racial history. Everything is riding on the outcome of the trial, says Keith Mays, an associate professor at the University of Minnesota's Department of African American and African Studies. Yes, Chauvin is on trial, and it's about the Floyd murder, but an argument can be made that it's about all the other folks that didn't receive justice too. That's why a conviction is necessary for us to reimagine what a future can look like, because these cases continue to happen until the police are thoroughly reformed, or in other words, until the police are instructed to stop arresting Black people, regardless of their actions. And again, this professor makes it clear that this is a show trial and that the verdict is known in advance. Can't you just feel these journalists luxuriating in this? This is from Associated Press, Michael Tarm and Amy Forlitti. Jurors in ex-officers' high-profile trial face heavy burden. One prospective juror's voice quivered as she told attorneys during jury selection that she feared for her family's safety if chosen for the panel that will decide the fate of a white former police officer charged with killing George Floyd. When the judge excused her, the woman exhaled in relief. Jurors at all trials feel pressure, knowing their decisions will alter lives. But the weight on jurors in Minneapolis is in a whole different category, as they'll be asked whether to assign guilt in the death of a black man that prompted some of the largest protests in U.S. history. Oh, protests, is that what they are? Again, see, this woman knows what's going on. That she knew that she would be coerced into voting to convict Chauvin if she was on the jury. And then if that happened, then she and her family would be at dire physical risk. That doesn't sound like a fair trial to me. Does it sound like a fair trial to you? Hikma Warrior, yes, imagine the death threats on the jurors. Josh Randall Disavow says, in other words, diversity doesn't work due to elites playing us against each other. MF Superstar says, imagine being Chauvin defense and getting him acquitted. Rest of your life would be fear and being loathed. I want to know more about this and what gained from the Floyd thing, says 2 cents. Well, there was a black man who led the so-called Symbionese Liberation Army, and he called himself a field marshal or something like this with a made-up foreign name. Now, after he was shot to death by police in Los Angeles, in fact, everyone in the house was killed, I don't recall him being made a hero because he was a rather unlikely hero. George Floyd is even more unlikely. Again, a career criminal who once shoved a pistol in the belly of a pregnant woman, saying that he would murder her in her house unless she came up with money and drugs. And there was no money and drugs in the house. A former porn actor. I see that his family got something like $25 million from the city of Minneapolis. And this was announced before the trial. Again, that doesn't sound very fair, does it? Well, I guess the first mother, it was reported that after Floyd was killed, that she called her parents or her children into the room where the TV was and said, do you know that man? And the children said, no, we don't. And she said, that's your father. A very close family, wouldn't you say? Those jurors should be able to change their identities in a case such as this, says Oscar Toe. Well, if you remember the O.J. Simpson case, where, he's clearly guilty. Oh, yeah, I have to get out of town right now. Oh, by the way, I'm leaking fluid, but that's completely unrelated to the death of 2 people. Completely unrelated. Let's see. Red Pills and Timbits, A Life by KMG. I don't like Timbits, actually. Give us Barabbas, says Steve. Yes, just so. And let's talk. I don't want to talk anymore. Let's talk about COVID-19 because the panic. Oh my God, the panic. This is from Sophia Rosenbaum, who writes for the Associated Press. Dear Normal, were you really that great in the first place? Okay, here we go. It's all about building back better. That we can't go back to normal because normal was bad. Dear Normal, everyone wants you back. It seems every day of this late stage pandemic era is marked with someone wistfully talking about normal. Going back to you, starting new with you. It's all about norms and normalcy, all about you. As for me, I'm not so interested in normal. I defer to Taylor Swift, as all intellectuals do. We are never, ever, ever getting back together. Oh, people used to complain about, commuting, and I guess people don't do that anymore. So that's a gain, right? That, Billy Joel gets quoted. The experience of living through the year-long aberration feels like the rapid-fire history verses of Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire, condensed into one tumultuous year. The world shuts down, a racial reckoning, dread word, a divisive election, loss after loss after loss, a previously unimaginable attack on the peaceful American transfer of power, a jittery inauguration, multiple vaccines, and a glimpse of a world beyond the pandemic. After living through all that, going back to normal feels more and more like returning to a lover we just can't seem to leave. It's everything is personalized. Personal, not just the political, also the sociological. Oh, people dreaming about not wearing masks. Apparently everyone is wearing masks. Is dreaming about this. And again, I go out into the street and I see more than half of the people wearing masks. Do they have any idea how big the atmosphere is? Will there be any systemic change? Not likely, pandemic author Sonia Shah said on a recent episode of John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. We usually go right back to business as soon as the thing ends, as soon as we have a drug, as soon as we have a vaccine. We don't really do the fundamental social change. What? How is the one connected to the other? Oh, yeah, COVID-19 has something to do with Black Lives Matter. It has something to do with equity, etc., etc., etc. It's a virus. That's all it is. Yeah. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. Dopamine-starved trendies desperate to get to any form of musical festival and take 900 million selfies of themselves in mask, taking COVID tests and accepting all kinds of draconian restrictions in exchange for some fun, are now demanding that singer Ian Brown be canceled because he has vocally opposed the introduction of vaccine passports in order to attend music events. It remains to be seen whether any form of vaccine passport will be used at the festival, but if it is, Brown will almost certainly refuse to appear anyway, having recently pulled out of other events that have decided to implement such systems. He tweeted, all major festival promoters have held talks with SAGE/government since early December, planning vaccine proof as condition of entry. Money is their god. Any musician going along with this is a collaborator and a disgrace. And so you get the whole lineup of people going onto Twitter to, here's a man who, he doesn't agree with the government having total control of our lives. So he pelt him with vaccines, one of them says. Yes. The sadism was always inherent in the lockdowns. But you notice how lately it has risen to the surface, that these people are no longer even trying to hide it. There's no crying in medicine, Rochelle Walensky. But no, apparently there is. This is from Marissa Fernandez at Axios. CDC director warns of impending doom as COVID cases increase. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Rochelle Walensky went off script at a briefing Monday and made an emotional plea to Americans not to let up on public health measures amid fears of a fourth wave. I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom, Walensky said, appearing to hold back tears. We do not have the luxury of inaction. For the health of our country, we must work together now to prevent a fourth surge. Oh, man. Let's see. Oh, this is from Maeve Reston at CNN. Birx shares her chilling conclusion as America arrives at a moment of introspection on the coronavirus. I thought Americans were having a moment of introspection about, George Floyd. I guess, you can do two at once. The U.S. may finally be getting a handle on the coronavirus pandemic, but for so many Americans, it's too late. And that disconnect is raising fresh questions about why the U.S. couldn't have done more earlier. Dr. Deborah Birx, who served as the White House coronavirus response coordinator under the Trump administration, reveals her chilling conclusion in a new CNN documentary that the number of coronavirus deaths could have been decreased substantially if cities and states across the country had aggressively applied the lessons of the first surge toward mitigation last spring, potentially preventing the surges that followed. Yes, lockdown ends, more cases. This just happens over and over again. But people like Dr. Deborah Birx, they don't seem to understand what is happening. That, yes, apparently a year ago, people just had too much freedom. And it's unacceptable. The previously sainted Dr. Theresa Tam is now being dragged because apparently she didn't somehow shut down Canada completely a year ago. This is from CNN. Betsy Klein. Biden calls on state and local officials to please reinstate the mask mandate. I'm reiterating, or repeating, as a normal person would say, my call for every governor, mayor, and local leader to maintain and reinstate the mask mandate. Please, this is not politics. Reinstate the mandate if you let it down, Biden said during remarks on the state of vaccinations Monday. The plea comes as some states have lifted requirements for face coverings as well as guidance on restaurant capacity and other measures, and cases have again begun to rise. Last week, the administration called on states to slow the relaxation of COVID guidelines. With a nod to the role of the private sector, Biden also suggested businesses should also require the use of masks. The failure to take this virus seriously is what precisely got us to this mess in the first place. Risk more cases, more deaths. How is it different anywhere else in the world? You see this planted axiom here that America singularly bungled its response to COVID-19, but you have the same panic and lockdown, open up, lockdown, open up in Britain, France, elsewhere in Europe. Biden renewed calls for Americans to wear masks, framing the choice as a patriotic duty. I need the American people to do their part as well. Mask up, mask up. It's a patriotic duty. It's the only way we ever get back to normal. But didn't we just hear that normal was pretty crummy and that we can't go back to normal? As far as mask mandates go, this is Paul Joseph Watson from Summit News. More than 2 weeks after the media predicted catastrophe due to Texas lifting its mask mandate and Joe Biden labeled the move Neanderthal thinking, hey, cool it with the anti-Neanderthal remarks, Biden. COVID cases in Texas have dropped to a record low, while hospitalizations are at their lowest since October. Earlier this month, Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced an end to mask mandates and a 100% reopening of the state by March 10th. The announcement was immediately met with a wave of hysteria from leftist politicians, commentators, and the media, much of which has been compelled by Jeffrey Tucker, and included Vanity Fair reporting the news under a headline which read, Republican governors celebrate COVID anniversary with bold new plan to kill another 500,000 Americans. California Governor Gavin Newsom asserting that the decision was absolutely reckless. Dr. Fauci warning that it is just is inexplicable why you would want to pull back now. Virus expert Michael Osterholm telling CNN we are walking into the mouth of the monster. We simply are. Beto O'Rourke hyperventilating over the move being a big mistake and a cult of death. Kurt Eichenwald accusing Abbott of making a murderous decision. Joe Biden proclaiming the move to reopen Texas as a form of Neanderthal thinking. Addicted to panic. That's what these people are. Addicted to panic. This is from the U.S. Sun. Joe Biden's administration is reportedly developing a vaccine passport that will allow Americans to return to pre-pandemic activities. But critics have slammed the initiative in partnership with private firms as un-American over privacy concerns. You know, if it strikes me that if these vaccine passports are made mandatory by the U.S. government, then Joe Biden or anyone else, they have no reason then to oppose ID being shown before people can vote. Because what this vaccine passport would be national ID for Americans. Biden views the so-called vaccine passport as key to meeting the administration's goal of emerging from the lockdown and returning to normal this summer. It is thought they will be available for free on people's smartphones. Vaccinated Americans will be able to flash a scannable code. Those who do not have smartphones could print out a code on a piece of paper, according to the Washington Post. New York State officials have launched a digital Excelsior Pass, which is similar to a mobile airline boarding pass and uses a secure QR code. It will be accepted at major entertainment venues like Madison Square Garden and Albany Times Union Center. Other countries and entities, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, China, and Japan, are working on their own versions of vaccine passports. The White House's coronavirus czar, Jeff Zients, is working to coordinate with various government agencies. I've always found it significant, this use of the term czar with regard to the American government. It doesn't sound very democratic, does it? It sounds very much authoritarian. But what good are these passports? It's an excellent story, which I highly recommend at Conservative Woman Co. UK. Vaccine passports are a con trick, whatever they are called. Here's the gist of it. It's a status certification scheme will be a snapshot that is out of date 60 seconds after the last test or vaccination someone has undertaken. Viral pathogens are ubiquitous and are omnipresent in every facet of our daily lives. They cannot be eradicated, and attempts to mechanically diminish their presence are the worst form of wishful thinking that will do nothing more than hoodwink the public. As a footnote, it is worth mentioning here that there are estimated to be a trillion viruses in every cubic meter of the entire surface of the planet up to the stratosphere. Attempts to eliminate the virus are a vain enterprise that is clinically impossible and medically pointless. And more talk of the uselessness of PCR tests. But I guess we knew about that already. In Canada, suspend AstraZeneca use for people under 55. Vaccine committee recommends. Wasn't it just until fairly recently that people were being, canceled for noting problems with vaccines? Also from Canada, Grace Life Church pastor returns to pulpit after jail time for breaching COVID-19 public health order. Pastor James Coates returned to the pulpit after being jailed in February for flouting COVID-19 public health measures. The church, just a few minutes west of Edmonton in Parkland County, has continued to hold packed Sunday services, despite RCMP and Alberta Health Services inspectors appearing each week to ensure public health measures aimed at stemming the spread of COVID-19 are followed. RCMP officials have repeatedly stated those measures were not followed while they were on scene. You know who started this? CBC reporter. Yeah. Oh my God, all these people going to church. The former premier of Alberta, Rachel Notley, now opposition leader, is not happy about this. She tweeted a call for Grace Life to be shut down, saying, "Enough is enough. So many other congregations across the province have made sacrifices and adapted their services to comply with public health orders. The people attending this church are not above anyone else. The refusal to follow the rules puts others at risk." COVID-19, it's been catnip for atheists because the churches have been shut down or they have voluntarily shut themselves down, with a few exceptions from evangelicals. Last night, I walked in front of the St. Andrew's Cathedral in Edmonton, which is about a 10-minute walk from here. And it's still locked down. Still locked down. So for the second year in a row, Easter has been canceled for Roman Catholics. Are they still paying the priests? The bishop, is he still getting paid? Because they are no longer providing the sacraments to people. So what good are they then? It's a serious question. In some medical news, I am not a doctor or a medical professional, so I'm just reporting what other people say. This is from Sebastian Rushworth, MD, and he asked the question, is zinc effective against respiratory infections? He notes that vitamin D has been found to shorten the frequency of respiratory infections by a small amount of people who are not deficient and by large amounts in people who are deficient. I figure that it's time to look at the third nutrient that is frequently touted as being protective against respiratory infections, zinc. I can only cite my own experience, but I have been taking zinc daily for about 25 years, and I didn't start taking it because of a fear of respiratory infections. I started taking it for a different reason. But I found that I stopped getting colds and the flu after I started taking zinc daily. Again, I'm not a medical professional, but I will mention this. If you do take zinc, make sure that you take it with a meal, because otherwise it will leave you feeling, pukey. So let's take a look at lockdown skeptics. And Brits can now go to the beach. Hooray! Brits are now allowed to travel out of their local areas to go to the seaside, the government has announced. And again, it's like 15 months ago. The government is telling people we can't go to the beach, we can't go to the park, we can't go to church anymore. And we've accepted it. We've accepted it. 40 MPs call on Boris to ease travel restrictions. Yes, the British government seems to be determined to destroy the tourism industry. Panorama breaks story on cross-contamination in Lighthouse Lab covered by lockdown skeptics last November. Better late than never, I suppose. Tonight's episode of Panorama, Undercover Inside the COVID Testing Lab, reveals that staff at the Lighthouse Lab in Milton Keynes have been cutting corners and processing samples in a way that could lead to cross-contamination between test samples. Readers will recall that lockdown skeptics published an expose of the very same lab by an ex-member of staff in November of last year. The story on BBC News uses the phrase potential contamination, but incredibly does not use the phrase false positives, as if the contamination could be in both directions, with some positive becoming false negatives after being contaminated with material from negative test swabs. Obviously, that isn't possible. The contamination is all in one direction, negative samples being contaminated with material from positive swabs, thereby becoming false positives. Dr. Martin Evison, a retired professor of forensic and biological anthropology and occasional contributor to Lockdown Skeptics, has been in touch to comment on the BBC News story. He says, I don't suppose this news from the BBC will come as news to anyone who has worked on the PCR analysis of trace samples. It is exactly what one would expect from a rushed high-volume mass testing with limited and secretive verification. The BBC article still hasn't mentioned a key issue in relation to contamination, that is, the use of negative blank controls. These should be included at key points in RNA extraction and analysis to establish that purification and PCR steps, test plates, manual or automated liquid handling, and so on are free of invasive SARS-CoV-2 RNA or derived DNA contamination. Blanks should be run regularly to ensure background contamination to measure background contamination in the laboratory or production line. I made a futile attempt to find out what controls were being used via a Freedom of Information request some months ago, but didn't get very far. So we have all these people deemed to be infected because of testing, which is contaminated. Yes, London has 0 COVID deaths on one day for first time in 6 months. Does that mean the end of the panic? No, as we have seen, oh no, the 4th wave is coming, or the 5th, or the 6th, or the 17th. And let's have a look at Alex Berenson's Twitter feed. I suppose he must be feeling vindicated by what happened. You know, but Tom Wolfe once did an illustrated essay about the man who was right too soon. People who are right too soon are generally reviled because it's embarrassing to everyone else who was wrong. President Biden calls on states, localities that have lifted mask mandates to reinstate them. This from the Daily Caller. Berenson says, you must reinstate your mask mandates. We are very tired of all those charts showing no difference in states with and without mask mandates. If every state has a mask mandate, the rate of charts will decline steeply. Also, this has nothing to do with politics. Also, where am I? And Berenson points out that this continued call for masks. Yes, David Lindstrom wrote, mask mandates are an excellent illustration of the failure to take COVID-19 seriously. When people stubbornly impose measures that are ineffective, it calls into question everything else they say too. Well, you know, you just can't be too careful. The Z-Man is now writing for Tacky's magazine, and he has a column today, which is called President in Name Only. In AD 65, unrest spread throughout the Roman Empire in response to the increasingly despotic rule of Nero. It started with the Pisonian conspiracy, which was an attempt to restore the Republic. Nero's suppression of it reduced his support in the Senate, which led to further instability. In AD 68, Gaius Julius Vindex rebelled against Nero's tax policy in Gaul. His plan was to replace Nero with a provincial governor named Galba. The revolt was put down by the legions stationed at the border with Germania. Vindex committed suicide, and Galba was declared an enemy of the state. The instability opened the door for an ambitious Praetorian Guard prefect to launch a plot whereby the Guard would shift their loyalty from Nero to Galba. Not long after, Nero committed suicide, and what followed was the Year of the Four Emperors. The relevance to this age is that what followed was a long period in which the real power in the Roman Empire had no official role. The Praetorian Guard could make or break an emperor, so they had real power, but they existed outside the rest of the political structure. The American Empire appears to have entered a similar period in which it is not entirely clear who is in charge of the state. This was made clear last week when Joe Biden held his first official press conference of his administration. Biden was disoriented and slow in his responses, even though the questions were submitted in advance and he had prepared answers. At one point, he stopped pretending and just read a statement about North Korea off his sheet. His struggle to do that underscored the fact that he is president in name only. Now, this is not a revelation. During the campaign, it was clear that Biden was a shambling husk of a man. The internet was full of hackneyed jokes about his campaign being weekend at Biden's or operating out of a nursing home. It was clear that while Biden was the candidate, he had no role in his campaign other than to shuffle out on stage when told to by his handlers. He was just a figurehead. To be fair, few politicians in the modern age have control of their lives. They are more like prize fighters than political leaders. An organization exists around them that is composed of the interests financing their campaigns. The job of the politician is to perform when needed, but the day-to-day running of his office and political life is left to the professionals who manage him, just like a prize fighter. You remember when President Obama said that he could do the job, everyone who worked in his campaign, he could do any of those jobs better than the people who were doing them. And I thought, this man's self-love is absolutely off the charts. Oh, how about staging a campaign appearance? All the things that are involved in that. Obviously, Obama wouldn't have the first clue of what was required. No, but he was just ever so smart. As Z-Man continues, with Joe Biden, we have something different. An existing organization, most likely the remnants of the Obama administration, augmented by units from the semi-permanent ruling class, has installed Biden as the titular head of the cabal. Most likely, they auctioned off the VP slot. Kamala Harris proved to be as popular as rectal cancer in the primaries, but she somehow ended up as a VP. The result is that we have the first purely theatrical presidency. Biden and Harris are just actors playing a role. Neither of them has any say in policy. Biden is unable to form enough sentences to articulate anything more than a lunch order. Harris is just a marionette that no one would bother asking for an opinion. Biden's struggles with dementia underscore the absurdity of her placement on the ticket. The Praetorian Guard problem from Rome lasted until 312 AD when Constantine defeated them at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Things move faster in this age, so it will not take 300 years for the problem of a shadow government to be resolved. It will not take a few emperors before people figure out that we have a shadow government that is beyond the reach of the official political system. The question for now is who really is in charge? The Praetorian Guard were visible for all to see, even if the role was not always clear. Our shadow government operates outside public view. Wall Street and Silicon Valley provide the money for sure, but who's the hub of this wheel of intrigue? Who is running the conspiracy of shadows? Biden's sad performance is putting that question in everyone's mind now. Jim Kunstler, thinking along similar lines, he asks this morning, do you believe in magic? Which was a hit song from the 1960s by the Loving Spoonful. Kunstler begins, the people pretending to run the world's financial affairs do. The more layers of abstract game playing they add to the existing armatures of unreality they've already constructed, the more certain it becomes that they will blow up all the support systems of a sun-setting hyper-tech economy that now has no safe lane to continue running in. Virtually all the big nations are doing this now in desperation because they don't understand that the hyper-tech economy is hostage to the deteriorating economics of energy, basically fossil fuels and oil especially. The macro mega system we can't grow anymore. We're now in the degrowth phase of a dynamic that pulsates throughout history as everything in the universe pulsates. We attempted to compensate for degrowth with debt, borrowing from the future. But debt only works in the youthful growth phases of economic pulsation when the prospect of being paid back is statistically favorable. Now, in the elder degrowth phase, the prospect of paying back debts or even servicing the interest is statistically dismal. The amount of racked up debt worldwide has entered the realm of the laughable. So the roughly 20-year experiment in central bank credit magic as a replacement for true capital formation has come to its grievous end. Excuse me. Hence, America, under the pretend leadership of Joe Biden, ventures into the final act of this melodrama, which will end badly and probably pretty quickly. They are about to call in the financial four horsemen of the apocalypse: modern monetary theory, a command economy, universal basic income, UBI, helicopter money for the people, and for the Build Back Better infrastructure scheme. MMT is the idea that a nation which claims a monopoly on issuing money can create new money ad infinitum with no negative consequences. That is, we can lend ourselves money, borrow it into existence, without having to worry about paying it back. The theory caught on only because that's what we've done for 2 decades, and so far it hasn't destroyed the banking system, though debt turned exponential, which is to say ruinous, only recently. So we won't have to stand by long to see how this experiment works out. Note this too, MMT completes the divorce between productive activity and capital formation, that is, prosperity without wealth. A command economy means that government increasingly attempts to take over economic enterprise to replace X million individual economic choices of freely acting people in a society with bureaucratic central planning. Have you already said ha ha ha, knowing that how that has worked out through history? UBI is the primary feature of that because in a command economy, production is mostly pretend. So you just have to give people money for nothing. Remember the old basic operating system of the Soviet Union stated succinctly as, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Got that? The idea behind Build Back Better is to renovate the infrastructure of a hyper-tech economy that actually no longer exists because we are in the contraction phase of a historic pulsation or cycle, leaving us with lots of tech and less production, tending towards zero. Nobody flogging this slogan actually knows what it ought to mean under the circumstances, which is to go with the flow of the reality of this contradiction, to downsize, downscale, and relocalize all our activities to bring them back into sync with actual productivity, that is raising food, making real stuff, and trading it. Again, it's the energy dynamic. I've seen, I don't know, I don't want to scare anyone, but I've seen some pretty frightening predictions made about the world economy this year. But meanwhile, we have the comedy of our Prime Minister, Princess Rockstar, being mocked by the Chinese. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says China has to address the world's concerns about the treatment of Uyghurs living in the Xinjiang region. This is from Rachel Gilmore at Global News. Last week, Canada joined the United States and the United Kingdom in slapping sanctions on China due to allegations of horrific mistreatment and abuse of China's Uyghur population. We have always been very, very strong in our defense of human rights and highlighting our concerns for what's going on in China, Trudeau said. Over the weekend, China hit multiple Canadian and American politicians with sanctions in apparent retaliation. I don't understand how that works. Hitting foreign politicians with sanctions, unless you go to China, how can they hurt you? Of course, China is acting as if they already own Canada, which I don't know, perhaps they do, because that would certainly explain their behavior. Following the announcement of the sanctions, one Chinese government official took to social media to call Trudeau a boy. And this is from Li Yang, who is China's consul general in Rio de Janeiro. He tweeted, "Boy, your greatest achievement is to have ruined the friendly nation relations between China and Canada and have turned Canada into a running dog of the U.S. spendthrift." 3 exclamation points. I don't really know what the spendthrift has to do with the rest of it. Apparently, it was clarified that this was his personal account. Okay. So not to be seen as, official view of the Chinese government. From the Globe and Mail, a Chinese diplomat calling Prime Minister Justin Trudeau boy in a sneering attack via Twitter over the weekend, yet another example of Beijing's ongoing shift to confrontational diplomacy. Running dog is a phrase typically associated with Maoist China, an insult hurled against imperialists that is meant to evoke the image of a dog running after its master for scraps. It is similar in meaning to lickspittle or toady. Its use by a Chinese diplomat against a foreign leader is unusual, even by Beijing's standards. "If your aim is to win hearts and minds in the West, it is clearly failing," said Richard McGregor, a senior fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute in Australia and the author of Xi Jinping, The Backlash, which examines how Western countries have turned against the Chinese president and his increasingly authoritarian and expansionist policies. But if it is to both prepare foreign countries for a new world order and also display your toughness to an assertive leadership at home, then it is working a treat. What diplomats such as Lee have said is partly performative, McGregor said, but the hard truth is that the Wolf warriors reflect the mood of a ruling party which thinks it is in the ascendancy and is in no mood to listen to naysayers. China's outspoken diplomats have often been dubbed Wolf warriors in reference to a nationalistic Chinese action film. Yes, at a recent summit with the United States in Anchorage, China's top foreign affairs official Yang Jiechi said the United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. Well, you see, Canada has a very serious problem when it attacks China for human rights violations, because I don't know for the last 10 years or so, every Canadian, maybe 20 years, every Canadian leader has been apologizing endlessly for everything that has happened in Canada's history. This is from Canadian Press. Apology in the works for descendants of Canada's only all-black battalion. Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan paid tribute Sunday to Canada's only black unit to serve during the First World War, saying the 600 members of No. 2 Construction Battalion and their descendants are owed an apology for the racism they faced despite their willingness to serve. The 600 members of the No. 2 Construction Battalion are all dead now. There's nobody left to apologize to. Sajjan said, "We know that there are painful parts of our history, injustices that contradict the values of our nation. These are parts of our history we must never forget. These are the wrongs that we must acknowledge and learn from." Like residential schools. Ottawa blames retired senator survivors for undermining the trust in residential school compensation system. Yes, Canada is routinely accused of committing genocide against its native Indians. To people who are obviously unfamiliar with the word genocide means. But no, how can we play holier than thou with the Chinese when we're constantly berating ourselves for our wickedness, current and historical. I use this phrase PR spiv. Simon Heffer, the English journalist and biographer, came up with it with regard to David Cameron, the former prime minister. David Cameron, before he ensconced himself in the Conservative Party backrooms, he's had one private sector job in his life, which was working for a PR spiv for a TV company, basically negotiating with government. And it looks like Cameron is in a fair amount of trouble now. According to the Daily Mail, David Cameron told friends he was in line to make $60 million from the listing of Greensill, it was claimed today, amid a growing row over the former PM's involvement with the financial firm. There are rules about lobbying, and you have to register if you're an ex-politician, and Cameron did not register. The finance company, which went bust earlier this month, was previously valued at $7 billion. And a friend of Cameron told The Times he had been candid about the potential windfall resulting from his shareholdings in the firm. But the company's collapse means that Cameron's share options have been left worthless. What a shame. The Times said sources close to Cameron yesterday denied the claim that he had told friends about the potential value of his share options. It comes amid calls for an inquiry into Cameron's involvement with the firm after allegations surfaced that Lex Greensill was given privileged access to Whitehall departments. It also emerged today that the firm is being investigated by French authorities over an £15 million loan to a smelting plant. Everything's up for sale. Let's have a look at the chat before I move on to James Burnham. Star Rover says, I watched the testimony of a POC witness wondering if Chauvin's lawyer is throwing the case. Lawyer let that guy express his opinions about Floyd's medical condition while he was in police company. ID politics. It's always coverage, never ending of culture war. Is it a war when only one side is playing to win? Let's scroll down here in the chat. Our Finnish friend Jaakko Raipala says China's economic development is going to lead to an enormous collapse of native languages as ethnic minority groups abandon traditional nomadic lifestyles in favor of economic opportunities in cities. You need permits to live in Chinese cities, and the book that I was discussing on Friday describes the life of the people who are not the favored people in China. It's pretty dire. The Coming of Neo-Feudalism by Joel Kotkin. It's a pretty dire situation for men because they aborted all of these female babies, and now there are no women for the men. I wonder whether China is going to fall victim to what is called the revolution of rising expectations. That's when people think that things are going to get better and they don't. They become very angry. When they are, trod on forever, you don't get much rebellion out of people like that. What is this? Septius7 says MMT is literally the entirety about real physical production rather than the financial capital, which neoliberal and libertarian want unregulated finance. Professor Paul says Chinese men are taking Ugandan wives now. Well, they're also, I suppose, they're taking Uyghur men because the Chinese government has decided to literally breed the Uyghurs out of existence. And I don't know whether that's something that has ever happened in the world before. Okay, Brandon Smith says, when Bernie got cheated, I figured no Dem had a chance, but voters are immensely stupid enough to even vote in the first place. Jaakko Raipala says, well, they are consistent. The genocide of Native Americans is pretty much the same as the genocide of Uyghurs, i.e. China sending their kids to schools where they have to learn Chinese. Septius7, MMT admirer, it seems. Would like to learn what it was like to live under the boot of a real empire as opposed to our clown shoe empire. I mean, that's from Steve. Starting to see price inflation at supermarkets, says MF Superstar. Well, the money's got to go somewhere, right? It's chasing down the same amount of goods. The usual doom-mongering with consular complaints and run. Well, it's in the nature of being a doom-monger that you only have to be right once. And, our governments are saying, oh, no, we have to, stop using fossil fuel and replace it with what? Replace it with what? With windmills? Okay, let's go to James Burnham talking about the meaning of democracy. And this is quite relevant, given what has happened in Washington. 2 months before this speech of Vice President Wallace's, an interesting expression of another facet of Bonapartist doctrine occurred in the sudden message by which the president ordered Congress to pass new anti-inflation legislation. The president said, I ask the Congress to take this action by the 1st of October. Inaction on your part by that date will leave me with an inescapable responsibility to the people of the country to see it that the war effort is no longer imperiled by threat of economic chaos. In the event that the Congress should fail to act and act adequately, I shall accept the responsibility, and I will act. At the same time that farm prices are stabilized, wages can and will be stabilized also. This is what I will do. When the war is won, the powers under which I act automatically revert to the people to whom they belong, unquote. Now, of course, the United States is always at war now. President of the United States is commander of chief when the United States is at war, but the wars are simply unending. Burnham comments in this short passage, there's very much rich material for future research in United States constitutional theory. It is particularly enlightening to understand that the executive, as the directly responsible agent of the people, is now able to supersede Congress, and that the powers under which the executive is now acting are derived not from congressional legislation, but again, directly from the people, who, to judge from the implication of the last sentence, have for the time being turned them over to the executive, who can exercise them as unlimited attorney. If the people had not given up their powers to the executive, there would be no meaning in the province that in the promise that after the war, the powers would revert to the people. When we keep in mind the connection between Bonapartism and the formula of democracy as government by the people, we should not be surprised by what might otherwise seem to be a paradoxical political phenomenon, the rapidly growing number of individuals in this country who may properly be called democratic totalitarians. Pathological newspapers like New York's PM, frustrated poets like Archibald MacLeish, choleric bureaucrats like Harold Ikes, gutter columnists like Walter Winchell trying to crawl out of the gutter, guilt-ridden banker sons like Corliss Lamont, authors like Walter Millis, trying to lead the public to forget that they once thought there was something to be said against war. Ambitious detective story writers like Rex Stout, ministers enjoying the platforms that they get from fellow traveling with the Communist Party. These people are, as we can readily discover from their speeches and books and articles, the most extreme Democrats in the country and quite possibly in the world. In the name of their democracy, they preach the attitudes of Bonapartism, and they advocate the suppression of the specific institutions and the specific rights and freedoms that still protect the individual from the advance of the unbridled state. Huey Long knew much more about politics than these persons will ever know. When he said that if fascism destroys democracy in this country, it will do so in the name of democracy, he was correctly predicting the role that the democratic totalitarians are today playing. His opinion, expanded into the language we have been using, may be put as follows. The Bonapartist development of the democratic formula of self-government will be used in the attempt to destroy those concrete individual and social rights which were once associated with the idea of democracy. It should not be imagined that this phenomenon is confined to the United States. Some people have the naive opinion that in other countries despotism was established in the name of despotism, that dictators who were in the process of destroying freedom made clear to the people that they were doing just that. Naturally, it never happens that way. The modern despotisms have all marched to the tune of the workers or the people. The Stalinist Constitution of 1936 is, we are assured, the most democratic in the world. Nazism expresses, according to its own account, the aspirations and highest freedom of the entire German people. And indeed, when Europe begins to get conquered by Germany, of all European peoples, and would doubtless do the same for the peoples of the whole world if Nazi arms should be fully successful. Honest men have never been able to get an exclusive patent on the words of democracy. So I'll have more from the Machiavellians tomorrow. And yes, let's talk about Satan's shoes. All 666 pairs of Lil Nas X's Satan shoes sell out in under a minute, following conservative backlash against the rapper's special edition Nikes that contain human blood. The 666 pairs of Lil Nas X's special edition Satan shoes sold out in less than 60 seconds after the controversial footwear was released on Monday. The rapper retweeted a post from XXL magazine that read, "Just in, all 666 sold out in under a minute." Lil Nas X collaborated with the streetwear company Mischief on the black and red sneakers that contain a drop of human blood in the sole and cost $1,018 a pair. How do we know that they actually contain a drop of blood? You know, are people going to be doing forensic examination of these shoes? I got cheated. You promised me a drop of human blood and I didn't get it. I mean, all they have to do is say that they're adding a drop of human blood. The sneakers are modified Nike Air Max's 97s, though Nike is not involved, and contain a reference to the Bible verse that tells of Satan's fall from heaven, Luke 10:18. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem has said that the soul of the nation's kids is at stake. The shoes coincide with Lil Nas X's latest single, which sees him seducing the devil with a lap dance. Yes, he's a homosexual man. Music video has been viewed more than 29 million times since Friday's release. On Sunday, the rapper, whose real name is Montero Lamar Hill, put out a short YouTube video titled "Lil Nas X Apologizes for Satan's Shoe." But instead of an apology, the video showed the shoes and the devil lap dance. Let's see. What else do these shoes have? The classic Air Max 97s have been revamped by collaborators Mischief with the underworld in mind, coming in a limited edition of 666 individually numbered X/666 in red embroidery. The kicks also contain 66 cc's of red ink as well as 1 drop of human blood. And I can see a pentagram there on these shoes, a very large pentagram. And there's another pentagram on the inside soles of the shoes. Satanism, apparently not controversial any longer. You may think that it's made up, but as Thomas Fleming once said, even if you think it's all made up, would you like to live next door to people who actually believe that they can kill others with curses, with chants? I don't think so. Yes, finally, some good news. In the Daily Mail, ship carrying 20 containers filled with sex toys that had been caught in Suez Canal traffic jam will now be able to complete its delivery as crisis reaches its climax. Ship filled with sex toys is among the 400 boats waiting to pass the Suez Canal. Well, I guess it's been unclogged now. Is it not? And not content with threatening war with Russia, China, Iran, the United States is now deciding to go after Britain in a trade war. It must be the special relationship we hear so much about. Again, from the Daily Mail, the U.S. is threatening to impose tariffs of up to 25% on some UK exports as it retaliates over Britain's new unreasonable and discriminatory tax on big tech firms. The UK introduced a digital services tax last April in a bid to ensure search engines, social media platforms, and online marketplaces pay their fair share. But Washington believes the tax unfairly targets U.S. firms and is now pressing ahead with countermeasures as it applies the pressure to Number 10 to change course. The increased tariffs on UK exports could be imposed on items like makeup, coats, dresses, shirts, ceramics, gold necklaces, air conditioning machines, furniture, and game consoles. The UK digital services tax, first unveiled back in October 28 by then-Chancellor Philip Hammond, applies a 2% levy on the revenues of big tech firms. The tax applies to companies with worldwide digital services revenues of more than £500 million and UK digital services revenues of more than £25 million. Downing Street has promised the tax will be scrapped once a global solution has been hammered out to ensure tech firms pay proportionate amounts of tax where they operate. And before I move on to Music Monday, two last things here. Universal mental retardation again from the Mail. Princess Beatrice has narrated a book to empower children with dyslexia ahead of Children's Book Day. The 32-year-old royal, who has been candid about her own struggles with dyslexia growing up, was filmed narrating Extraordinary People, published by Penguin Random House's Children's, from her home at St. James Palace in London. The book was written by Kate Griggs, the founder of global charity Made by Dyslexia, of which Beatrice is an ambassador, and the foreword was penned by Sir Richard Branson, who is also dyslexic. The royal, who was diagnosed age 7, said she now sees her dyslexia as a tremendous gift. How could it be both a burden and a tremendous gift? Did she use the word superpower? Yes, dyslexic superpower. It's the opposite of that. A condition which makes it difficult or impossible to read. This obviously, a serious condition, but it's become so fashionable for people to boast of their dyslexia now that I suspect a great many of them are making it up. So we talked about women's soccer last week. Football. Let's talk about women's basketball. This is from Megan Turner at Outkick. The NCAA Division I men's basketball championship budget for the 2018-19 season was $28 million, almost twice as much as the women's budget. Information provided by the NCAA to ESPN on Friday shows that the men's tournament brought in a total net income of $864 million that season, while the women's event lost $2.8 million, the largest loss of any NCAA championship. Women's basketball, yes, is pumped up by the NCAA. It's pumped up by the NBA. The only people interested in women's basketball are the women who play it and lesbians. Oh, no, they can't dunk. Excellent fundamentals. That's a joke from Futurama. No, people don't want to see it, but we've been gaslighted into believing that, oh, no, just given enough exposure, women's basketball will be enormously popular. And I suppose, it's like women's hockey. Women's hockey is really only a thing in Canada and the United States. And so, in world tournaments and the Olympics or whatever, my country and America get to smash all these other countries where I don't know, there's probably 30 women in the whole country who play women's hockey, and 22 of them or whatever are on the national team. Again, let's have a look at the chat. Dyslexics can see how backwards everything is, says Brandon Smith. Let's see. MMT. Oh, another more about MMT. Prussian Juncker says anyone who uses the phrase unironically the special relationship with regard to the USA and UK has never studied the history of those two countries in full. You should never use that term, Kevin. I know I am using it ironically. And I don't really understand what is it that Britain is supposed to get under this so-called special relationship. The United States government deciding that the IRA must win in Ireland. A lot of people would see that as a hostile act. The Austrian concept of instant price equilibrium is objectively false, and some of the smarter Austrian school admitted their system would be flawed if prices were sticky, says Septius 7. Okay. Oh, wow. This fellow's really going on about it. Jonathan Pohl says what the Stalinist Constitution 1936 did guarantee personal property rights for white people. Huey Long, that is a name I have not heard in a long time, says Steve. Yes, every man and king. It remains His murder remains rather mysterious. I mean, do doctors normally, get involved with shooting other people to death? Very, very strange. Very strange. Let's move on to Music Monday. And I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of the record producer that for a while, for some decades, I suppose this is, it's rather, coincident with the rise and fall of rock music, that the nature of the music studio changed. That in the past, music was recorded very quickly indeed. That, a band or, a singer would come into the studio and they just knock off track after track after track. That machines were rather primitive in those days, both for recording and for playing music. But with the rise of so-called high fidelity, I guess in the 1950s, and I guess this stems from the German invention of magnetic tape, it became possible to put more and more information on a recording. And this led to much greater sophistication in recording studios. Now, if you want to look at classical music recording, well, it's completely different, because the orchestras or the string quartets or whatever, they know their pieces, and they know them at a very high level. And of course, having 100 people or so in a recording studio is expensive. So they just they play, and if there's a mistake, well, okay, we'll take it from here, and they'll record some more, and they'll there's some differences there. Some like to play all the way through. Others will just record inserts. But I suppose the great producer, in the way that they became, and the very first of which was Phil Spector. Phil Spector spent an enormous amount of time on his productions, and he invented what was called the wall of sound. And this was, Phil liked mono. He liked monophonic sound because his records were made to be played on mono. That they have the tremendous force from the doubling, tripling, and quadrupling of parts. Very large number of people in the studio. And Spector's techniques were copied by Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who typically used the same session musicians that Spector had used. Now, if you want to look at Britain and the British invasion, you see, if you look at, say, the Beatles, their audition, or the Rolling Stones audition, it's like, get into the studio, just, come on, whack it out, one after another, one after another, one after another. Let's record a whole album in a few hours. Now, of course, the songs in the beginning were quite simple. They were simple lyrically, and they were simple musically. But I suppose from the middle of the 1960s, popular music got a little pretentious, if you will. And popular musicians had pretensions to to greatness, if you will, both lyrically and musically. It became a lot more complicated. And we see George Martin with the Beatles, the fifth Beatle, he was called, although there are many people who were called the fifth Beatle, that we see with George Martin, the use of the recording studio itself as an instrument. And we see songs being created in the recording studio. Ideas taken there, little bits being strung together, being amplified, and the producer was in charge of this. Now, there are some producers who are engineers, and some producers who are not engineers. George Martin, I suppose his value was of an arranger more than anything else. And also, if you look at a song like Strawberry Fields Forever, it's in very weird keys because of, speeding up tape, slowing down tape, because it's two separate parts, which were stitched together. The Beatles began, as I say, just knocking out tunes one after another. But by the end of their careers, they were taking dozens of takes of songs, 50, 60, 70 takes. And partly because as musicians, they were not, they were not the greatest. Also partly because they're constantly experimenting in the studios. And you see wonderful effects that were achieved on purpose or actually by accident. Now, if you look at someone like Brian Eno, he had a strange career. He was this weirdo who would like to record the sound of worms, say. And then he got work as a sound man for a band called Roxy Music, and then he got invited to play the synthesizer in that band, which he did in a way that was different from all other synthesizer players, because essentially they used the synthesizer as a keyboard instrument. And so he makes 2 records with Roxy Music, and they're a success, and he is fired from Roxy Music, supposedly because Brian Ferry, the singer, the front man, who wrote almost all the songs, supposedly was jealous of him. And Brian Eno says that, he's a non-musician. And he famously played in the Portsmouth Symphonia, which was a classical group of people who couldn't really play their instruments. And I've heard their records. There's a kind of interesting, there's a charm to them, But Brian Eno starts producing records, and he becomes this, this guru, like godlike figure. And U2 hired him. I guess they hired Daniel Lanois, the Canadian, as well. That somehow they have the secret to making hit recordings. I suppose it's not so much just hit recordings, because there's lots of hit recordings that are not critically acclaimed, but Brian Eno seemed to have the magic touch of making hit recordings which were critically acclaimed. Another star producer, Todd Rundgren, who was a musician, of course, but he became more famous as a producer than as a musician, and produced, so many different types of bands. He produced Badfinger, he produced the New York Dolls, he produced XTC, and strangely, a few years ago, there was this rather savage back and forth between Todd Rundgren and the front man of XTC, Andy Partridge, where Partridge said that he greatly admired and still does Rundgren's talents as an arranger, but he said that as a producer he wasn't very good, and he said that he'd heard similar things from all manner of bands that had worked with Todd Rundgren. And I suppose most cruelly, he said that Todd Rundgren was not a very good engineer. Now, so we go from mono to stereo, and as I say, the amount of information that could be put on to recordings became greater and greater and greater. The number of tracks, you start with 2-track, the 4-track, 8-track, and then eventually you end up with 128 tracks or 256 tracks. And with digital recording, the number of tracks that you can have is pretty much infamous. So you start looking for ways to fill all of those tracks. And I suppose this leads to, many cases, leads to music which is too cluttered. I should mention Teo Macero, who is well known for producing the records of Miles Davis, and his production technique was rather similar to that of Holger Schuckai of the German band Can. So you have a band playing any number of things, just playing, jamming, and Schuckai and Macero, they would listen to the tapes and they would chop them up, literally with a pair of scissors, and reattach them to form musical compositions, completed musical compositions, where there was previously no musical competition. Now, recording studios are expensive, and I think that the decline of the producer comes from two things. The decline of rock music itself, because typically a band would spend weeks or months in a studio racking up an enormous bill, and the records needed to sell a large number of copies in order to pay that studio bill. When rock music rather died, if you will, certainly became moribund around the year 2000, where there was very little interest in music being made for straight white men. And so how to justify the costs of spending all this time in the studio? Because you can buy equipment now, not very expensive, where you turn your desktop computer or your laptop computer into a recording studio. And so I guess we see a return to the simplicity of the earlier days. I mean, you used to have these names. Oh, Glyn Johns is recording, is producing you. But now, if you look at, and I get a lot of amusement from this, when some hit record like Beyonce or whoever comes out, I go to the Wikipedia page, and there's a lot of people who devote a lot of time to tracking down all the information, and I count the number of producers which are on the records. 5 producers, 10 producers, 15 producers, sometimes more than 30 different producers on a record. We're talking about, 10, 12 tracks, 40 minutes, something like that, and over 30 producers. Well, there's a reason for this, and the reason is that record companies want blockbusters. Now, it's the same thing happened to the music industry. The same thing happened to the publishing industry. We don't want to put out a lot of product, and some of which is going to be a hit, some of which is going to be a bomb, most of it's going to be somewhere in the middle. No, we only want to produce hits. And we believe, the record industry thinks, that it is, scientifically, they've cracked the code on how to make hits. Essentially what this is taking a look at the music that was popular, say, over the last 6 months, and duplicating it with some variations. And the reason for so many producers on a record is because you have all of these different, production styles. So, okay, we get, one song from this guy or these guys, and that's going to be a hit because they've made hits before, and you just repeat that. You repeat that endlessly, and people complain that music all sounds the same now, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is it seems the records now have all the same songwriters on them. They have all the same producers on them. They have all the same mixers on them. And it used to, groups or singers, they would hire specific producers, and they'd be looking for a specific sound. I mean, if you look at, say, the English band Wire, who have been performing for 45 years now, they're still at it. They still sell records. They still sell out concerts. They hooked up with a EMI producer called Mike Thorne. And Mike Thorne was very keen to experiment in the studio, to try different things, sometimes very strange things. He produced a song called Tainted Love, Soft Cell's cover, which is one of the highest recording singles, highest selling singles in history. But, Mike Thorne had this reputation of being, an intellectual producer. And so, people who wanted an intellectual approach would go to Mike Thorne. But record companies do not let bands get away with that sort of thing anymore. I mean, not if they're spending the record company's money. Actually, they're spending their own money, which has been borrowed from the record company. And it seems that to this day, a lot of musicians don't understand that all this being splashed out is their money, or if they're lucky enough, it will become their money. But I find it all very sad, because the rise of the producer coincided with a tremendous expansion of the vocabulary and the grammar of popular music. The idea is that you could produce anything in the studio, and a lot of people tried very hard to produce anything, but we're not interested in that sort of thing now. I suppose that the rise of what the Germans call occasion music. I mean, if you look at hip hop, rap music, nobody listens to that music. There's an amusing scandal that so many of these wicked beats, it's just presets on a synthesizer. This music is for what? It's for fighting too. It's for using drugs too, having sex. It's not something that is considered apart from its use, from its occasion. Let's have a look at the chat. Weezer singer studied the science of hit making, says MF Superstar. Media Hit says, I found a couple of canned CDs at a thrift store, $1 each, Tagomago and Soon Over Bamaluma. I love both of those records to death. Let's see. Printed in real kiss blood, says Pitsky. Jonathan Pohl, it's good, but I prefer Five Leaves. So we're talking about Nick Drake here. Elastica with Connection, taken from Wire. Great song. Yeah, it is a great song. And they just, it was stolen. I believe that there was 2 or 3 songs from that record that were ripped off from Wire. The singer of the band, Justine Frischmann, she was always carrying on about how much she loved Wire. Now, if you're going to talk about how much you love a band and then rip them off, you're just asking for trouble. Adolf Himmler says ELO's Jeff Lynne, very underrated producer. Yeah, he's good. But the idea, hooking this guy up with Tom Petty, you wouldn't think that would work, but it did. I would not recommend watching Lil Nas video, says Visionary Companion. No, it's not a good idea. And I wonder how many people are going to be sucked into the world of the occult because they go to YouTube and decide to check this out. Again, stay away from the occult, kiddies. Oh, favorite Nick Drake album. That's a hard choice. I mean, there were only 3 originally. I don't know. This is kind of cheating, but I might have to go with a compilation. There was a compilation from Island Records that came out, in 2004, I believe. Let me check this out. Made to Love Magic. Yeah, it came out in 2004. It's got the version of, let's see, the song that was done on the first record was redone in a version with Rebop Kwakuba on congas. 3 hours. Yeah, superior version, which was rejected the first time around for some strange reason. Okay, saw Wire here a few years ago. Brutal gig. Brutal in a good way or a bad way? Okay, around 95, Michael Jackson's labels were looking to spend $30 million in marketing to revamp his career. Didn't he end up owing Sony an enormous amount of money? You know, he had like statues, Stalinist-style statues of him erected. What, there's one in Budapest? It's like 30 feet high or something. Absolute madness. I just love the story of Jarvis Cocker of the band Pulp. And this is a true story, by the way, that it was at the British Music Awards. And Michael Jackson was up there, and there was like a choir of children, and he was being treated, you know, as the Messiah. I think there may have been a priest or rabbi on stage as well. And Cocker simply couldn't stand it. And he got onto the stage and started doing a parody of the dancers. And this was considered completely outrageous, you know, and he was taken off the stage and thrown out. And the next morning, he woke up to find out that he had become England's most popular man, because finally someone had the nerve to take on the Michael Jackson cult. Halper says, interesting, because 3 hours is my favorite track on 5 Leaves. That Michael Jackson story, everything about it it's so distressing, you know, and there's just no end to it with those children of his, if they have any biological connection to him whatsoever. What is coming up on the show? It's Holy Week. And so on Theater Thursday, I am going to discuss a strange and beautiful movie by Eric Romer from 1978 called Percival La Galois. And on the book club, I am going to be discussing Evelyn Waugh's biography of Monsignor Ronald Knox. And next week on Music Monday, I'm going to be talking about a composer who was very dear to my heart. His name was Hugo Wolfe, and he lived from 1860 to 1903. You know, he's known as a songwriter, and he wrote hundreds of songs, but he wrote other kinds of music. I mean, he just had it was almost impossible for him to get his orchestral compositions played by orchestras. He later orchestrated some of his favorite songs on text by Eduard Murica, and the orchestrations are really of outstanding beauty. So that's the show for today. I shall be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. Again, thanks to all of you who responded to my monetary appeal from not last Friday, the Friday before. If you would like to make a contribution to this live stream, my PayPal account is at Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you were in Canada, donations can be made directly via interac@kevingrace@shaw.ca. Oh, and this just in, Nike suing Mischief over Lil Nas X's Satan shoes. That ought to be fun. As always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear listeners and watchers, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.